ask each of the panelists to tell us about what are the one or two essential components of the initiative or innovation that they're leading in their locality. So let's start with Ron. I know, I'm sorry, we're gonna be like back and forth, but I'll try to break it. So, Ron, tell us.
Thank you. Let me just begin by introducing myself a little bit. So I'm a son of immigrants, and I came here at the age of 7 from South Korea. And within 10 years of my parents immigrating here, I still remember the day when they had to shut down their small business in the upper Manhattan. And they left an indelible mark with me. Where were the politicians? Where were the elected officials, policymakers, when the rent was going over the top, when their Targets and Walmarts are coming in and left them right? Where were they to stick up for people like immigrants like my parents and others like them? And that really pushed me to spend my entire public service career trying to connect the dots, like what happened in the last 40 years for people like my parents. Why are we in a position where we continue to subsidize the biggest multinational corporations with $9 to $10 billion in New York every single year of corporate giveaways? And how did this become so normal that we don't even question it? So a lot of my work has to do with reforming economic development and holding every dollar accountable and thinking about reinvesting that to really empower localities and states to reset the economy in a meaningful way, to start thinking about how can we actually buy and write down people's distressed debt. We talk, there are presidential candidates talking about canceling student debt, and that's from Bernie to Liz Warren, but I believe it's the states and localities that are in a much better place to identify which places that we can actually write down and invest in people directly. So that's one of the main things that I've been pushing for, to end corporate welfare and to cancel student debt.
Tell us.
Yes, of course. So we are a nonprofit organization, and so over the last 10 years, along with a coalition of 3 other organizations, we've been advocating for the legalization of street vending in Los Angeles. So for those of you that don't know, Los Angeles for a long time was one of the only major cities in the country where vending on any inch of the sidewalk was considered illegal. Illegal to the point that you could be charged with a misdemeanor crime. Now, under the election of Trump, what it did prompt for our local electeds is this consideration of any chargeable offense could set you in a proceeding for deportation. And so what they did recognize is that no one should have to face deportation simply for trying to make a living on our sidewalks. And so with the coalition that also includes a lot of the street vendors, we've been pushing for this, for the legalization and for the creation of a permit process. Now, for our organization, that also meant the consideration of access to capital. So we know that these same folks also don't have access to traditional means of financing, whether that's because banks just don't exist in their communities or they don't have the proper documentation to actually apply for capital. And so about 3 years ago, we started what we call the Semilla Fund, the seed fund that specifically was designed to service street vendors or home-based businesses. And so we use creative alternative forms of credit to really underwrite some of the street vendors. And really our fund, we recognize, is not large enough to support the 50,000 street vendors that are estimated to be operating in Los Angeles. But what we do recognize and what we do own is that we want to serve as a disruptor. We want to be able to tell our city government, we want to be able to tell finance institutions that it can be done. We can underwrite folks that are considered risky by very traditional means, and that you will get paid. Our fund has close to 100% repayment. We find that 67% of our borrowers are paying almost 70% more and above their minimum payments every month. And the reason for that is twofold. One is we develop a relationship with them where they understand that our goal is to help stabilize their business and ultimately help them grow. They also know that we're really the only source of capital for them. And so if they're really looking to grow their business and they want to come back, then we have to be able to work together. And so communication is actually key to our relationship. Now, why are street vendors important? Like I said, there's 50,000 in Los Angeles. We also recognize that about 75% of them are women. And so we know that studies that have been conducted by UCLA say that that's close to $500,000 in economic activity just in street vending alone. And so it was an important issue for us to take on and consider how do we create alternative systems to plug folks in and to demonstrate that it can be done and that it doesn't have to be expensive for a borrower.
Before we go to Kimchi, can you just say what is the size of the fund?
Sure, right now we are close to $500,000. We have about 42 borrowers. 70% of them are women. 70% of them are women. And they've used the capital mostly for equipment purchases and working capital.
Thank you. Kimchi.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. Just quickly about myself, I came from Vietnam and lived through the war, so I got a lot of experience sleeping through the bombs and the rockets and so on. So as a young age, I already wanted to know why there's so much suffering. So fast forward to today, as a practitioner, I see a lot of people in the practice, in my practice, and people breaking down. They have cancer, they have autoimmune, they have all kind of disease, and I have to get to the root problem. Why are they breaking down? That lead me to understand the conditions and the emotional, spiritual needs behind that. So that led me to the search of happiness. I ended up in the Kingdom of Bhutan. Within 2 years, I made many trips to Bhutan and got a very close relationship with many people there, including the Gross National Happiness Center and the royal family. So through that, I learned about how they operate and see that with their national policy of gross national happiness, they have become the first country and only country in the world that is carbon negative. So today I've founded Gross National Happiness Center Americas with the idea is to work with Bhutan and also to understand the condition of human beings. What is it that we need as a society, as a species, in order to change the paradigm, to move on as we create more cities in the future, whether we're going to move out into the ocean to create more cities or into space. We still need to know how to work together and apply policies certain ways so that we can be successful in the way we work together.
George?
Thank you. So Bristol is a city of about 500,000, west of London, on the way to the US. It's a city that always regarded itself as a bit different, a bit more independent, a little bit hippie in some ways. It's close to Glastonbury, where the festival is, and so it's always had some alternative thinkers. It started the Soil Association for Organic Food, for the Sustrans for cycling. So it's had this very green underlying activity, not green government. Now, I always say a good city is a city that's good because of the people in it rather than because of its governance. And it's those individuals who take actions. And there are two individual actions that I really want to highlight. One was the formation of our local currency, the Bristol pound. And I keep in my pocketbook wallet both, I've got American dollars, sterling pounds, and I have Bristol pounds. Bristol pounds are a complementary currency. They're a token in a way. You can just change them with a sterling pound. But now they're only 10% of what we spend with Bristol pounds. Mainly I use my phone, the app, and I turn up to the deli and it automatically knows I'm in the deli. I just pay immediately and it comes straight out of my account. What's important about the Bristol pound is it's not just a game about local spending, which is a really, really important nudge to people about how they spend their money. It's also a social enterprise in that we bank with the Bristol Credit Union. The Bristol Credit Union has all the deposits of Bristol pound. Those deposits are used to lend to really poor people on short-term loans. So people can borrow just for a week or two just to get them over until payday at low interest rates. We've now introduced 0% loans for startups. So it's trying to be transformational, but make no mistake, it is a minority sport. It is not taking over our national currency in any way. We're not allowed by the Bank of England to trade independently. It can only be one for one. We can't charge for exchange or anything like that. The other initiative that also came out of radical green individuals was us deciding we were going to be European green capital. It hadn't even been invented. But EU then decided they were going to have European green capital. They nominated Stockholm as the first European green capital. And we were determined that we would get there. And I got elected as mayor in 2012, just after we had actually introduced the Bristol pound, which I took as my salary, totally in Bristol pounds. And my first aim would get us over the line to be European green capital. And we did that because that was going to drive all change. And I strongly believe that if you take that as your driver, you take tackling climate change as your driver, because cities is where change can happen rapidly, while nations find change really difficult unless they're small, enterprising little nations like Bhutan, which have done fantastic things. But nations move slowly. So cities is where I believe the power of change happens. And we worked with Rockefeller, we worked with Bloomberg, we worked with various organizations, but the EU were great in enabling us to share information with other cities. So, local currency, driven by an environmental agenda, and sharing, stealing from each other to do good things. Those, to me, are the drivers.
And I think that's a really good segue into something, because I'm now sitting on the edge of the chair, so you can already tell that I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure you do too. I want to know if, and again, I don't want to do it in a linear way. Any of you can raise your hand. The question is, can you tell us, again, 1 to 3 specific things that you feel are transformations because of your initiative? So again, we are trying to talk about the power of the local to create models or ways or narratives that are not more of the same. What has changed in people's lives or in the dynamic of the city? Something that you can point out, and whomever wants to start.
Reduction of the domination of the car in the city. I talk about opening streets when I mean closing them to cars, because we're opening them to people. And it worried the police that I got signs printed saying street open when they meant street closed. But I really meant street open, because streets belong to people. We've stolen our streets from our kids who used to play in them. And so that is a major change. And I'm shocked by the domination of the car in the States. It's forcing us to breathe unhealthy air. It is taking most of the space in our city. It's overheating our cities because of the amount of asphalt. So I think if you were to take one single thing, reducing the speed and reducing the amount of space that cars take, then everything else works better. People get out on their bikes, they walk to public transit, and so it gave me an excuse. Being green capital gave me a driver to make changes like that. I could say many, many more things. I got every child to plant a tree. I mean, I think what I really was saying, there are hundreds of small things you can do that will make bigger changes in a city than big infrastructure. And we've made huge mistakes thinking that big infrastructure is the solution. Hundreds of thousands, and I've stolen these ideas. I've stolen them from Bogota, from Bordeaux, from any city beginning with B, and Boston.
Thank you. Any of you who wants to?
Sure. I think for us, one of the key drivers in our work, like I said, in piloting this microloan fund, was to challenge the perceptions and the thinking of our policymakers, of financial institutions, and of our own funders. So we've had conversations with funders that start with them telling us, well, and this is maybe last year, well, we would essentially be funding an illegal activity. Street vending is considered illegal, and so if we fund you to support this program, we are funding an illegal activity. And so being able to challenge our own funders to rethink, and these are funders that are using equity in their language, right? So to really rethink their own traditional way of looking at the work and being able to think outside of the box has been really instrumental for us. So not only have we changed policy in the city, we've also worked with a local senator who changed policy statewide, who said you can no longer criminalize street vending anywhere in California. And so that was pretty powerful. The other thing is that we're also getting our own lenders to reconsider the interest rates. Do they really need to charge us a high interest rate for us to relend? And so we've had financial institutions and folks in philanthropy that have come in and said, we really believe, because you've demonstrated the success of the economic opportunities of the borrowers, we are willing to lend at 0 to 2% interest, for example. So now we have folks, private folks, who are saying, if I lend you the capital to relend, you're probably going to make more money for me than if I put it in the bank. And so we're developing the tools to create an opportunity for individual folks to invest in the fund because they're interested in supporting the economic opportunities of street vendors, and then also recognize that our traditional systems are failing them as well.
If I may just digress a little bit, I think it's amazing what's going on in this panel, because we're talking about from complementary currencies and street vendors, and these are some of the most local forms of economic growth where we know that money and wealth is being recirculated and not extracted from our communities. And that's, I think, a very important theme that we should understand and why that's important. And for me, so I was the first elected official to fight against Amazon's expansion and growth into New York City. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and The Guardian, and which really picked up a whole group of grassroots movement against it. And we leveraged that opportunity to introduce legislation calling upon an interstate compact between localities and states to stop competing, race to the bottom scenario like Amazon. We already have 11 states lined up to signing this compact. And we're just really trying to empower the localities to thrive. So we saved New York City, New York State, I think $3 billion of unnecessary tax breaks for the next 10 years. And Amazon will continue to come to New York and hire regardless, whether we give them a dime. And they already committed to hiring 5,000 people after we didn't give them any subsidies. So this is one big sham, and I think we exposed it. And we just have to move forward and make sure that we can reverse the narrative where we can actually invest in local, independently owned small businesses, starting with the street vendors.
Kimchi.
in the case of Bhutan, it's very interesting what they have achieved so far as a small, tiny little country, just barely a dot on the planet. But what happened, how are they effective in terms of changing the climate that's affecting them? They are actually feeling their glaciers are melting. And so why we can be here and discussing about climate change, they actually have to do something, so they get together. And in their constitution, part of the happiness is good governance. As good governance, they start to put in legislation what to do to change, to help change the climate. So they put in their constitution, they amend their constitution to say that 60% of the land has to remain forestry. And with that, they are today at 72%. At 72%, they produce only 2 million tons of carbon, and their forestry can absorb 6 million. So they become the first carbon negative country in the world. So just changing the policy allowed them to achieve that, as well as many things they have done, little things. For example, they have a policy that if they're going to cut one tree, they're going to plant 10. On the birthday of the king, they plant 100,000 trees. And then they have this initiative where they see if they can break the world record of planting like 50,000 trees in 1 hour. So they've done it, they planted so many trees that actually the forest begin to grow and start to connect together that allow the wildlife to roam in order to adapt to the climate change. So they found the snow leopard move from east side to the west side for the first time. So they've done things like that on the smaller scale in order to respond to climate change. So I think for that reason, they deserve like a big applause for contributing to changing the climate change today.
Thank you. And I think everything that you are bringing into this discussion shows us models of possibilities. You mentioned, for example, Bogota. And I started teaching in Bogota in 1996. And I still remember, I thought it was a dismal city. And if you go to Bogota today, it's impressive. And it's always when you see the cities that are collapsed, they're dirty, they're violent, and all of a sudden you start seeing changes within 5, 6, 7 years. I'm not talking 50. And it takes visionary leaders, political leaders, and obviously the business community leaders like you, George, that in that case were 2 mayors combined. But anyway, doing from bike path, parks. People are still poor, there's still a lot of problems, but you begin to transform the sense of the city and the possibilities. So we are hearing some of it also from your own city. So the question I want to ask the panelists is, given what you have done and what has happened, in part because of you in the city or in Bhutan, how is that being adopted? How is that influencing other communities? And can you be specific? Like you talk about, learning from Bogota, and Bogota, I'm sure, learned from you. And then Medellin, which was the crime capital in the 1990s, is a beautiful city nowadays. Perfect? No, but beautiful. So can you, all of you, speak about how is what you're doing, developing a network? Because it cannot just stay there. And I'm sure you're also working on that. You're creating examples, models to change that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, we failed if we haven't influenced others. And like people have influenced us, we have been helped a lot by, I mentioned Rockefeller and Bloomberg, the EU, which we are stupidly trying to get out of. And we just hope that Boris Johnson fails in his endeavor to get us out of the European Union. But they've been really helpful in funding programs of joint programs where we've been able to build resilience plans, environmental plans, and share our thinking amongst amongst our cities. So I think, and then within the UK, we've formed a set of core cities, and within those core cities, there were just the principal cities outside London and Edinburgh, which are both capitals. Each mayor was given a specific task, and mine was on energy and environment. So I was able to help transfer some of what we had learned to some of the other cities. I can't say they've all grasped it with the same enthusiasm. We're all driven by different things. But I absolutely believe that being driven by the environment, driven by climate change, everything else follows. Health, well-being, cleanliness, all those things, safety, they all follow from having that single driver. And we have to get radical about it. And we got to get really radical about it. And after Paris COP, we moved from an aim of being 80% carbon neutral by 2050 to 100%. We've now moved that forward to 2035. That is a huge challenge. But, for what was an industrial city, but we've got to do it. And other cities are now following that. So we were the first in the UK to do that. But and we simply stole some of the ways of doing it from other more enlightened cities like Copenhagen.
Yeah, well, that's how it goes.
Yeah.
How about you, Ram?
Yeah, I mean, when I was debating some of the issues on some of the Fox or MSNBC, the feedback that I would get, the positive feedbacks were either the socialist or the right Republican, conservative Republicans when it comes to ending corporate welfare and protecting local economies. It was always been the middle, moderate Democrats that don't know what to do with me. So that's been the biggest challenge for me to kind of overcome the normalization of my own party, of my own moderates that think that bigger is always better and that the too big to fail is the right way to go, right? And that's become such a normal practice. We don't even question it internally. When we do, oh, you're an anarchist, you're a socialist, you're a communist, you're this and that, you're libertarian, whatever. They come in with the labels. So that's been very difficult as a lawmaker for the last couple of years. But at the same time, there's a whole generation of young, involved political activists that they understand the root problems of our society. They understand that there is no justice without economic justice. And it's not about just social and racial justice. We have to get to the economic justice. And they understand the difference between social, racial, and economic justice. And they understand how for years we've criminalized our poverties and while dehumanizing the most vulnerable members of our communities are looking away. And they're the ones that I think are going to be leading the coalition of the policies that I truly believe in.
So let me see if we're understanding what you're saying. It in part is that what's being, the model is the involvement of politicians like you in the local, in being with the local, growing with the local businesses and strengthening the community is developing a new breed of politicians. They find resistance among some moderates, but it is the way it's going. It's going with force and it's growing. Am I interpreting?
We're at a full conflict. I mean, people were probably trying to primary or run against me next year from the establishment moderate machine types. So they're still in control. That's the reality. They're still in power. The Governor Cuomo of New York is the face of corporate Democrat. Like he is it. And along that paradigm, it's everywhere from local, state. They're the ones that are still in power. But I'm doing my part to support the insurgents that are really trying to institute the changes that we desperately need.
Great. Azusena and Kimchi, can you tell us about how your models, your initiatives are being adopted by others or influencing changes beyond your community?
Sure. So one of the things that we're really excited about is we're an open source. So we'll talk to and share our tools with whoever is interested in using them. And so a few months back, the County of Los Angeles, so for those of you who don't know, there's the city proper, City of Los Angeles, and then there's the county that's made up about 88 smaller cities. And so the county approached us and said, we are really excited about what you're doing, but we don't know how to do it. So are you interested in helping us deploy capital? So they recognize that they're good at deploying capital to larger small businesses that have 50 employees or more. And so we're going to pilot with them our product at a county-wide level that we hope will reach those folks that are at the bottom of the pyramid, as we like to think of, those folks that are constantly overlooked. And so we're hoping that if the pilot at the county level is successful, then we'll have other counties and cities across the state also looking at ways to replicate the model.
So in the case of Bhutan, I think it's really cool. So what they do is that they send people, they did a survey, send people down to each family and ask each family what makes you happy, what keeps you happy. So they start to do a survey and come to with the result that to identify their 4 main pillars of happiness, from good governance to social equity economically, and to conservation of nature and cultural preservation as their main 4 pillars. And from that 4 main pillars, they developed 9 domains, which are all the metrics to measure happiness. Then they use that as a metrics to guide national policies. For example, when they start to make a decision, let's build a bridge, let's build a casino. So as they start to talk about that, they use the GNH lens, gross national happiness lens, to look through, does it cause problem in a family? Does it cause the people stop going to church, for example? So they use that lens to evaluate whether or not that decision would be the right decision as they establish, they promote GDP. So that same system allowed them to flag issues when there's a problem so that they can inform lawmakers whether or not it is a good decision or not. So that could be applied in all levels of cities and school and corporations and national policy, because they truly care for the well-being of each subject in their country. So they don't just only measure and go by the GDP, how much can we grow, gross domestic products. They also now rename today as gross domestic problems. As well, so they use GNA, gross national happiness, as the guide to every decision they make, and through that way they are able to slow down the damage or the destruction to the country overall. So I think that can serve as such a good guiding format that can be applied in all structure of cities and government agencies.
So I want to open this up to you guys, because I know you're like burning with questions. And if you're not, I'm burning with questions, so I'll do that. But before we get to the burning of questions, I want you to tell us what would be one central idea that you want to leave us with? I mean, we're going to go out of this room. We have heard so many things. Some of us are looking forward to the wine hour, whatever, the rejuvenation, whatever it's called. And I want to be grabbing people. Let me tell you what I heard from Ron. So we want that central idea that you want us, just to keep on thinking about. What is that central idea?
I think for me, and this is one thing that we harp on constantly, is that we need to revisit the policies that are not serving or advancing the betterment of the most vulnerable folks in our communities. And so for us, that's one thing that will continue to guide our work, and the advocacy piece on how we can change those systems to better improve the lives of those in our communities. And we also recognize that it's not just a change in policy, but then there's also the access to capital, especially in communities that have traditionally been marginalized and have been left out of systems. And so how do we continue to bridge that gap and not lose sight of those that are most vulnerable in our communities as we're having all of these high-level conversations. And so grounding it on policy change and then creating access where it's previously been denied.
I want to bust up big tech, and just one thing that people can walk away. Like, I want to break up or bust up the monopolies in the modern age, which is dominated by Amazon, Facebook, Google, the FANGs, as they're called. Yeah.
And I would say the best way of doing that is to buy local. We all have the power to change things by buying local. So that's the point of a local currency, is that it is a nudge to say, let's buy local food. Let's encourage our farmers to stop selling all their produce to the big supermarkets who rip them off. Let's have a new markets economy rather than a market economy. Let's make quite sure that we're helping local startups, that this is the best way of getting people off the streets, getting people into productive work. More people are employed per pound, per dollar, by the small businesses than are by the big businesses. The money stays circulating in the local area, and by a factor of probably 4 or 5 times as long if you have a local currency that keeps circulating. So develop a circular economy, a regenerating economy that is not simply a linear one that goes shooting straight out to the big corporates and to the shareholders.
I find that one of the key factors to really solve what's going on today, to truly care for the happiness and well-being of each individual, in that human beings, we have different perspectives. And if we understand what is really our need underneath, if we can understand our life purpose, why we are here, and be able to collaborate and work together, we can solve problems on any levels, whether it's a city levels, or national or planetary level. If we understand the needs of who we are as a species. And I was at a space conference a few days ago, and the astronauts all say the same thing when they were in space. One thing they realized is that there's only one planet and there's no borders between. They see no borders between countries. And in that moment, when they're in the space station, they become friends with the Russians and the Germans and so on. So what I'm getting to that is that if we understand the need of each person and can help provide that well-being and create the condition for the well-being and the happiness to happen, we can all work together, we can solve any problem on this planet at any levels.
Well, thank you. Let's thank the panel and then open it to questions.
Ron, I'm by no means a fan of Amazon. Whole Foods has changed a lot since they've purchased them. I think some of their marketing tactics are extremely dishonest. But how do you fight against the argument that, yes, you would have given $3 billion in tax credits, but the revenue that you would have gotten from the personal income taxes from the employees would have been $27 billion?
Sure. I mean, we've seen some of these companies, not just Amazon, but upstate New York, throughout the country, well, they make commitments and promises up front. When you look at 20 years of data, they never fulfill those commitments, and we end up where. Understood, yeah. So I think the problem with the way that this was constructed, there was no clawbacks or any kind of transparent language. They signed a non-disclosure agreement with the public, could not see the terms of the 10-year agreement. So I think we would have been okay if we felt guarantees that and the public could actually read the clauses. But it was the governor and the mayor and Jeff Bezos who, and just three white men, cut that deal without the public having any input. No elected official, no community. That was the biggest hurdle. So part of the aftermath, we have legislation to mandate clawbacks, yearly reports to make sure that the ROI is there. But the governor refuses to go near the legislation. Because economic development has been, for many executives, a way to dole out money and monetize of public funds and public programs for their own personal gain. And that's why I fundamentally have an issue with how it's constructed.
Questions?
Thank you. This is a great panel. Thank you to all of you. The question I have is, I guess it's kind of a dialogue between George and Ron, which is, New York City a few years ago seemed like it was heading in such a great direction in terms of bike lanes and greener transportation. And I feel like we've had a roadblock. And as you know, there have been a recent spate of bicycle deaths in New York. But we're also just kind of, it seems to me as a biker, we're sort of stuck in a place where we've got some nice bike lanes, but then a lot of our bike lanes are just small lanes within, the avenues, the big avenues where all the cars are, the trucks are turning, and we have this commerce and everything. So the question I have is, how do you get the car owners within the city to accept the street openings? I love that phrase. I want to steal that. Because we just seem to be having that kind of conflict between the bikers and the car owners, and how do we get past that so that we can become a greener city where more people are biking, kids can walk in the street without being afraid of being hit by cars?
I advocate starting with events. I started a thing called Make Sunday Special. Make Sunday Special was nothing to do with church. It was all to do with giving an excuse to do things differently on a Sunday, to try them out. And that was where the opening of streets started. Actually, the opening of streets had started earlier, funnily enough, and this was dangerous territory to tread when I was mayor, with my daughter, who decided that her children had nowhere to play, so she started something called Playing Out. And if you look up playingout.net, you'll find that was temporary, it was events, but now it's spreading all over. It's spreading all over Europe now. And so I'm a great advocate of events. That's where I learned from Bogota, actually, about using weekend events. And then it opens people's eyes, because everybody fears change that they haven't experienced. All adults do. And so I think that's where I begin. I mean, I was tempted. I was staying in New York for a week, and I was walking everywhere. And I was tempted to draw up a plan that took out half the streets from cars, because it would be a very simple thing to do physically, to do a block plan a bit like they're planning in Barcelona, where half the streets are access only, not through streets. And instead of having this one way everywhere, which means people rush, you have two-way in all the streets as well, that slows them down. But the other streets are there for cycling and walking and trading and all that human activity that makes for good community social life. I'm surprised that didn't get there. I felt that Bloomberg was moving in a direction of making it a more pedestrian and cycle-friendly city. It seems to have stopped, as you say, and I'm really disappointed by that, because the air doesn't feel good. So it takes a really brave mayor to just say, hey, half these cars are coming from outside anyway, so they don't have votes. The rest of the cars are a real small minority of the people who have votes. So why not just take the risk and do it?
I mean, there's so many complicated layers to this problem, and we've instituted our version of congestion pricing this year, which should have an impact for the next 5-6 years, and curbing vehicles going into congested areas. But at the core, we're transitioning into a micro-mobility space where e-bikes and e-scooters are coming to places like New York City. But we also have to be careful about what we don't privatize public transportation, and that's been the direction that my biggest fear has been, the direction that we've been going for the last 20, 30 years. We've strategically, almost consciously starved the MTA, the Mass Transportation Authority of New York City, the biggest transportation authority in the country, of the necessary funds to actually survive for the last 30 years. And multiple governors, multiple mayors, and now we're relying on Uber to give us input, the biggest corporations to give us input on making public transportation policy, because they're the ones that have all the data points on how to execute better policies at the street level. So we are already inching toward privatizing public transportation. It's a dangerous thing to do, because what these e-scooter Fords, they think they're tech company. No, this is like Ford getting into e-scooter space, coming into underserved communities like mine, and saying, these are good for immigrants, these are good for low-income communities. Well, how are my unbanked immigrant communities who don't have credit cards gonna actually have access to sharing e-scooters? Like, where is the data that in other cities that you actually served low-income communities? So I'm a fan of e-scooters. I actually enjoy, I want micromobility to expand, but we also have to be careful about how we move forward, because in a crisis moment when we desperately need better, greener public transportation, we may just jump on a solution that's in front of us without realizing we're just extracting more value out of our communities.
But in a way, you can't wait for the transportation, can you? Isn't it? Otherwise, it's chicken and egg. You have to. You need carrot and stick. Yeah.
So I think I'm getting a face that I'm assuming I'm running out of time. So I hope you have enjoyed small but beautiful and wonderful and with lots of potential. Thank you.